In this Warframe guide, I'm gonna give you the top 10 of the best melee weapons in the game that will cut everything into pieces, shower your foes in red crits, and of course, will be able to slice through steel path like a hot knife through butter. We're gonna talk about what makes them so great, how to best mod them, and of course also where you get them from. As always, a massive shout out to all my generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. But now, without further ado, let's jump right into it. The first weapon on today's list is a Tonfa style weapon, and we all know, when we're talking about Tonfas, there is one name that cannot be forgotten about, and that is the Cronin Prime, of course. And speaking of Cronin Prime, one thing I want to mention right off the bat is today's list will have a lot of Prime melees included. Because the thing is, in contrast to ranged weapons, which have a lot of variety also in the non-Prime category, in terms of melee weapons, the best of the best are, and mostly have always been, Prime melees. Now, for some of you that might not be a problem because you either have Platinum or you trade for it, but for others this can be a huge bummer because, as we all know, not all Prime items are always available in the game to be farmed. That's why on today's list we're not only going to talk about the Prime melees, but whenever I can, I will also give you a reasonably good non-Prime alternative to all the Prime variants that we're going to cover today. But for 1 second, let's actually talk about the Cronin Prime themselves. These Tonfas are absolutely amazing. They have quite a decent base damage with a high attack rate, and when it comes to crit and status, they're also very well set up. You're gonna deal a ton of bleed effects when you run this weapon, which is fittingly also exactly what this build right here is supposed to do. So, if you can, then you should absolutely go and add the Cronin Prime to your Warframe's arsenal. The next melee on our list is not arguably, but objectively the best one-handed sword in the game, and that would be, of course, the Pangolin Prime. See, one-handed swords have a long tradition in Warframe. They were among the first types of melee weapons introduced in the game in 2013, there's a large variety of them, and also they have a ton of good stance mods. So right off the bat, there's a lot of choice for you. And the one that most tend to regard as the best in slot one-handed sword is the Pangolin Prime. And when we look at the stats, you will also instantly see why that is the case. Just like the Cronin Prime, also the Pangolin Prime has 80% slash in its base damage. Combine that with the very high status chance of 30% and the also above average crit performance with 26% chance and a 2.2x multiplier, and you have yourself a very deadly slasher that can turn enemies into dust in a matter of mere seconds. Also, as a Prime weapon, of course the Pangolin Prime also comes with more convenience in the form of more innate polarities on its mod slots, in this case 2 V polarities, which is very nice for melee builds because a lot of the big melee mods that cost a lot of capacity are actually V polarity, so that means you might only have to add like 1 or 2 forma for your build. But I hear you say, Blacky, that's all nice and well, but the Pangolin Prime again is a Prime weapon, which means it will not always be farmable in the game, so not every player is gonna have the chance to get it after seeing this video. And I totally understand that. That's why I have a very broken and very strong alternative in the form of the arguably second strongest sword in the game, and that would be the Broken War. The great thing about the Broken War is that it not only has great stats, but also you get it automatically from finishing the War Within quest, so you don't even have to go and farm for it. And when we look at the footage in the background, we realize that the Broken War is called Broken for a reason. And while you're down there, give the video a like to make the YouTube gods not hate me. Cheers for that, by the way. Let's take a look at the most special type of melee weapons in the game. And that would be the Nakanas, with their best in slot representative on this list, namely the Nakana Prime. But Blacky, why are Nakanas so special now? See, when you play a melee build in Warframe, your Warframe will be all the way into the action, in the front line, and naturally your Warframe is gonna take some hits right there. So the only way to make a melee build work in the long run is to give your Warframe the ability to heal themselves so they don't just die on the field. And luckily, there are a lot of different options to do that. For example, you could go and use the helmet system to infuse Sevagoth's skill Gloom onto your Warframe, or also Garuda's Blood Altar, giving you effectively a skill available on any Warframe that leads to self-heal, or another popular alternative would be lifesteal mods on your melee like Lifestrike or Healing Return. And while all of that is nice and dandy and definitely works, there is one big problem with that. If you infuse a Helminth skill to heal yourself, that means you now cannot use any other useful Helminth skills like Rhino's Roar to drastically increase your damage output, or maybe Necros' Terrify to armor strip all the enemies around you. That option will not be there anymore. And if you go for the lifesteal mod on the melee weapons, that means you will always dedicate one of your 8 melee mod slots to a mod that is only there to heal you and not to put out more damage towards the enemies. And this is exactly the problem that Nekana type weapons, as the only melee class in the game, can solve. Here's how it works. First thing you need to do is you need to get the Daikyu bow. You can obtain the blueprint just from the Tenno lab in your clan's dojo, so no problem. And once you build the Daikyu, you're gonna put it in your loadout. You don't need to actually play with it or build it, so don't worry. The only thing you have to do is use the Amalgam Daikyu Target Acquired mod that you get from the Ruppel Lawless fight, and put it onto the Daikyu, and then of course bring the Daikyu as part of your loadout into the mission. Now what this specific mod does is, it has a side effect that gives all Nekana type weapons innate lifesteal without having to mod it onto the weapon itself. This way, you not only save one mod slot that you can now dedicate to actual damage output, you also can use whatever Helminth skill you want, because the lifesteal is actually coming from the Daikyu mod, and as a melee setup, you generally don't really care about your primary weapon anyway, so it's not a loss in that slot as well. And now, speaking about the Nekanas themselves, of course, the Nekana Prime is objectively the best Nekana in the game, but also here, if you don't have the Prime version and you cannot go and get it, you don't have to, because there are good alternatives. My personal recommendation would be the Sepp Fanzon with the components that you see in the background right now, but alternatively, the Siam, which you can get from Teshin's Cave in Deviri, is also a great choice. But let's finally talk about a non-prime weapon, shall we? This one is the Inodem. Now, the Inodem is a dagger, and it is an Incarnon weapon, which means in order to get it, you first have to finish the New War quest, and then you can obtain it from Cavalier on the Zeraman 10-0, already at rank 1. And I'm sure when I said dagger, a lot of you were a bit disappointed, but don't be, because this dagger right here is actually more like a sword in terms of range and its stats. See, not only is the Inodem very strong because it has great base stats, but as an Incarnon weapon, it also naturally has access to 5 evolutions, which make it even better. So let's take a quick look at these. Evolution 1 unlocks the Incarnon mode and also gives the Inodem 3 more range and plus 40% attack speed. That's, by the way, what I meant when I said that the Inodem is actually more like a sword, because with the plus 3 range, it exceeds what daggers are usually able to do. Then for Evolution 2, we could add more range, but with just half a meter, doesn't really make that much of a difference in my opinion, so I personally go for even more attack speed, because that means later in the build section, we don't have to use attack speed mods because of the plus 40% from Evolution 1 and now plus 25 from Evolution 2 as well. Evolution 3, however, depends. If you play a Warframe that can open enemies for finishers, then going for the finisher path is probably not the worst idea. But if not, then I personally would advise you to go for the combo. Evolution 4 was a no-brainer for me personally, because only a 3x combo multiplier to enter Incarnon mode? Well, sign me up for that. And then Evolution 5 again depends whether you play for heavy attacks, finishers, or normal combo. Now, looking at the build, because of the evolutions, as I said, we don't need an attack speed mod, which means we can replace that with something else, which is another great advantage over other melees. And as you see in the footage in the background, the Unidem is very much capable to hold its own even against very strong late-game enemies. Another melee that can hold its own very well and is arguably the best melee weapon in the entire game would be, of course, the one and only Glaive Prime. No top 10 melee list in Warframe can go without this. But why is the Glaive Prime so great? Well, with the build that you see in the background right now, you can hold the melee button to throw the glaive and then press the heavy attack button to explode it mid-air and turn all nearby enemies into molecular dust. Now, sure, all glaive-type weapons can be thrown, so no surprise there, but the Glaive Prime just has great stats and you can absolutely see it in the background. Small tip from my side would be, if you go for any glaive type setup, then go for a Warframe that can group up enemies into a small area or just infuse a grouping skill via the helmet system, then throw the glaive into it and enjoy the carnage. Unfortunately, however, the Glaive Prime is not only a prime weapon that is currently not available in the game, it's also so rare that even the cheapest offer on Warframe.market is over 350 platinum for a whole set. And I'm fully aware that this means it's going to be very unaffordable for many players out there. So of course, I also brought you a good alternative, and that would be, you probably already knew it, the Zoris. Now, the Zoris is of course not perfect, but with its stats it's still extremely strong, it works with exactly the same build, and the best thing is, it drops from the Granum Void in the Modern Corpus Fleet tile set, and thereby is available already very early in the game. In fact, I even mentioned it on my top 10 beginner weapons list back in the day. So, even if you're a fresh-baked tenno, the Zoris can still be helpful for your playthrough. Just like leaving the channel a sub so you'll never miss out on new and helpful guides day one. Welcome to the crew, but for now, let's go on. Next, the Venka Prime. These claws are not only absolutely insane, they also have a very special ability that no other melee weapon in the entire game has, and that would be their combo multiplier doesn't just go to 12x like for all the other melee weapons, but actually for the Venka Prime, the multiplier can add up all the way until 13x. Which of course means, again, the combo build is the optimal solution here. But while we're at it, let's talk builds for a second. As you might have seen, the builds that I've shown you so far for the melee weapons all look very similar. Why is this? The reason is, enemies in Warframe's late game usually have very high armor values, which means damage reduction percentages that are close to 100%. At the same time, however, the bleed status effects inflicted by slash damage ignore enemy armor, meaning that every melee weapon which has a high status chance and a high slash percentage in its base damage is going to be super strong against those big heavily armored Grineer high level enemies, and this build is basically going to be used on every slash melee in the game, which has of course the unfortunate side effects that every non-slash melee in the game is objectively inferior in today's meta, which is why we don't really have them on today's list, unfortunately. But as we all know, there is no rule without exceptions, so let's look at the one golden exception to this build rule, and that would be the next weapon on our list, the Hate. Unlike most other melee weapons on today's list, the Hate isn't built for combo, because the Hate is a scythe, and scythe weapons really want to be built towards heavy attack playstyles and not combo. So, looking at the build, we can already see that we're not utilizing combo mods, but rather those that increase our heavy attack damage and wind-up speed. Next, we go for Corrupt Charge, which might seem counterintuitive because it gives us initial combo counter, but that actually helps because with the higher combo counter, we get a higher crit chance from the set effect of the Gladiator mods, and also more damage when performing heavy attacks. Now, if this all sounds and looks good to you, then you can get the blueprint for the Hate as a drop from the Stalker. And this is unfortunately also the biggest disadvantage about the Hate, because the drop rate from the Stalker is very low, making the Hate very rare. The best alternative, if you want a heavy-hitting scythe, would be the Reaper Prime, because stat-wise, it's basically the same weapon. However, the Hate is still the king of scythes because it now can have an Incarnon adapter available, which turns it into an Incarnon weapon. Now, I gotta admit, I haven't tried it yet, but looking at the evolutions on paper, it looks like they're very much doubling down into the heavy attack playstyle, giving you more damage, more initial combo, and turn the Hate into an absolutely unstoppable beast. Hate Incarnon is definitely way up there on my to-do list. And speaking of unstoppable heavy hitters, let's look at the next weapon on our list, and that would be the Grand Prime. Oh boy, the Grand Prime is like the old OG heavy blade in the game. It's like the Tupac Shakur among all the new and shiny mumble rap wannabe melees. With 32% in both crit and status chance, plus a 2.6 initial crit multiplier, the Grand Prime is an absolute beast on paper and also in practice, because not only that, but also its base damage is, at the same time, very high, so as you might have guessed, we again go for the slash combo build. The only thing that we really need to look out for here would be the attack speed, because that is very low for the Grand Prime. However, with some mods or arcanes, we can really easily fix that. So yeah, if you like the feeling of hitting only once and leaving nothing alive, the Grand Prime is the melee of choice for you. But since the Grand Prime is again a prime weapon, there is also an alternative, and the one that I would recommend would be the Vitrica. It doesn't have as much crit as the Grand Prime, but therefore it has more base damage, and it can turn enemies into glass with its special attack. If that sounds good to you, then the Vitrica is dropped from the Nihil boss fight, which you can access from the Nihil's oubliette key that you can get from the Nightwave credit store for 60 Nightwave credits. The next melee is one of the, if not even maybe the, only prime weapon in the game not featuring any innate polarities, and that would be the Orthos Prime. Now, sure, a prime weapon without any polarities sounds very unsexy, I totally agree with that, but the Orthos Prime is widely regarded as the best polearm type weapon in the game. It has decent crit stats, a massive 36% status chance with high slash percentage, so again we go for a slash combo build, and its playstyle also supports this because it has a comparatively high attack speed. The only disadvantage that would come to mind for me would be the looks, because it kinda looks a bit boring, but if that's your concern, then I could recommend the Guandao Prime, because that has very similar stats, is also very strong, and it looks so much fancier. And with the Orthos and the Guandao both being primes again, the best non-prime alternative for the polearm slot, in my opinion, would be the Idun, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's also a weapon that you can get from Teshin's Cave in Deviri, also from the very start of the game already, if you should choose so. And while we're at the topic of the Orthos Prime, I want to give a shout out to a lovely Tenno out there who goes by the name Yaska. Yaska is a viewer from my German channel, and we randomly bounced into each other as I was leveling up the Orthos Prime for this video, and he spontaneously decided to bring out his Vault and speed level me through the Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, making this whole grind a lot more bearable. So big Tenno love goes out to you. And last, but definitely not least, another one of the very few non-prime weapons on today's list, and that will be the Slaytra. Now, given the fact that the Slaytra has to be bought from Chipper for stock, that makes it kind of also not easy to obtain because you have to finish the new war quest first, but the Slaytra is definitely worth it. It's a Grineer machete, and even though it looks kinda crappy on the outside, it definitely packs quite the punch. When we look into the stats, it deals a lot of base damage. It's basically as much as the Grand Prime, and that's a heavy blade wielded with two hands. Also, this damage is mostly slash, and it also has a very high status chance, so again, we go for a status combo build. The only thing we really need to take care of is, again, like with the Grand Prime, the attack speed, because for the Slaytra, that is also on the very low side of things, but you know what, we have mods, we have arcanes, so that's not really a problem. If you want to get it for yourself, then, as I previously said, you first have to finish the New War quest, then go and run the Cult's Garrison missions, about which I've already done a video all the way back in 2022, and then you just take the stock that you get from finishing those missions, go over to Chipper, and buy the blueprint for the Slaytra in his shop. As you can see, with the right melee setup, you can deal ludicrous amounts of damage. However, if you're not far enough into the game to be able to use all of today's toys just yet, you absolutely must check out my list of the best mid-game weapons right here. Again, a massive shout out to Akimbo Fate, Niels V, Lamies, Galganium, Demon Lord Zell, and all other awesome channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.